When people hear the statement that a narcissist will sleep with anybody, they often misunderstand what it really means. They assume it simply about desire, temptation, or a lack of morality. But if we look deeper into human psychology, we discover that this behavior is rarely about sex itself. It is about something much more profound, a deep hunger for validation and a painful disconnection from the authentic self. A person who develops strong narcissistic traits often learned very early in life that their worth depended on how others responded to them. Perhaps love was conditional. Perhaps attention only came when they performed, pleased, or impressed. Over time, the child learns an unconscious lesson. Who I truly am is not enough. I must constantly prove my value. That message does not disappear in adulthood. It simply changes its form. For many narcissistic personalities, intimacy becomes confused with validation. When someone admires them, desires them, or pursues them, it briefly fills the internal emptiness they carry. Sexual encounters then become less about connection and more about reassurance. Each new partner becomes another mirror reflecting back the message they desperately want to believe. I am desirable. I am important. I matter. But the relief never lasts. The validation fades quickly, because the wound underneath was never about attraction in the first place. It was about a lack of secure emotional attachment. And when the internal void returns, the cycle begins again. Another person, another encounter, another attempt to escape the quiet voice inside that says they are not enough. This is why the behavior can appear indiscriminate. It may seem like the narcissist will sleep with anyone. In reality, they are not choosing people based on deep compatibility or emotional connection. They are choosing opportunities for temporary self-confirmation. The person themselves often matters less than the validation they provide. Paradoxically, the narcissistic individual may fear genuine intimacy. True closeness requires vulnerability. It requires being seen without the mask of confidence, charm, or superiority. But for someone whose early experiences taught them that vulnerability leads to rejection, that level of openness can feel terrifying. Casual or superficial relationships feel safer because they keep the deeper self hidden. Understanding this dynamic does not excuse harmful behavior. People can be deeply hurt by relationships built on validation rather than authentic care. But understanding the psychological roots allows us to see something important. Beneath the arrogance or promiscuity often lies a wounded person who never learned how to feel worthy without external approval. Real healing begins when a person starts recognizing that the emptiness they are trying to fill cannot be satisfied by attention, admiration, or sexual conquest. It can only be addressed through awareness, self-compassion, and a gradual reconnection with the authentic self that had to be hidden long ago. When someone learns that their worth is not dependent on how many people desire them, the endless search for validation begins to lose its power. And only then does the possibility of genuine intimacy appear, an intimacy based not on proven value, but on simply being human together. When people observe narcissistic sexual behavior, they often interpret it through a simple lens. They assume it is about physical desire, pleasure, or temptation. From the outside, it can look like a person who simply enjoys variety, attention, or the thrill of conquest. But if we look more carefully at the emotional and psychological dynamics beneath the surface, we begin to see that the behavior is rarely driven by sexuality itself. In many cases, it is driven by a deep internal need to feel valued, admired, and emotionally secure. For someone with strong narcissistic tendencies, attention from others can function almost like emotional oxygen. It reassures them that they are desirable and important. Sexual attraction from another person becomes a powerful form of validation because it provides immediate and undeniable proof that they are wanted. The moment someone expresses desire for them, it temporarily quiets the internal doubts that they may carry about their worth. This is why sexual encounters can become less about connection and more about confirmation. The act itself may appear intimate, but the underlying motivation is often different from genuine emotional closeness. Instead of seeking to know another person deeply, the narcissistic individual may be seeking the feeling that comes from being admired, pursued, or desired. The partner becomes a mirror reflecting back the message they long to hear, that they are special, attractive, and worthy of attention. This pattern often develops much earlier in life. Many people who later express narcissistic traits grew up in environments where love was inconsistent or conditional. They may have learned, consciously or unconsciously, that their value depended on how they performed, how they appeared, or how well they pleased others. The authentic self, the vulnerable, imperfect human being underneath, may not have felt fully accepted. As a result, they develop strategies to secure approval from the outside world. Sexual attention becomes one of the fastest ways to obtain that approval. Unlike deeper forms of connection, which require time, vulnerability, and emotional openness, Sexual attraction can be immediate. A glance, a compliment, or a flirtatious exchange can instantly produce a sense of validation. For someone who feels internally uncertain about their worth, that quick reassurance can be extremely compelling. However, the sense of validation rarely lasts. After the encounter, the deeper emotional emptiness often returns, because the underlying need was never truly about physical intimacy. The act itself cannot resolve the emotional hunger beneath it. The person may then feel the urge to repeat the experience, seeking another source of admiration or desire that will temporarily restore their sense of importance. Over time, this can create a repetitive cycle. Attention leads to temporary relief, relief fades, and the search begins again. The partners themselves may change frequently, not necessarily because the narcissistic individual lacks the ability to form relationships, but because the emotional goal of the interaction was never true intimacy in the first place. At the same time, genuine closeness can feel threatening. Real intimacy requires a person to reveal their authentic self, including vulnerability, insecurity, and emotional needs. For someone who learned early in life that these parts of themselves might be rejected or ignored, that level of openness can feel deeply uncomfortable. Sexual interaction with emotional exposure can therefore feel safer. It provides the illusion of closeness while protecting the hidden self from being fully seen. Human personality does not develop in isolation. It grows within the emotional environment of childhood, shaped by the way a child is seen, treated, and responded to by the people around them. When we look at narcissistic patterns in adulthood, it is tempting to interpret them as arrogance, selfishness, or a simple desire for admiration. But when we examine the roots more carefully, we often find that these patterns began as adaptations during very early stages of life. A child enters the world with a fundamental need to be accepted for who they are. They need to feel that their emotions, their needs, and their natural personality are welcomed and valued. When this kind of secure emotional environment exists, the child gradually develops a stable sense of self-worth. They learn that they are worthy of love without needing to constantly prove it. Their identity forms around authenticity rather than performance. However, not every child grows up in an environment where this unconditional acceptance is present. Sometimes love and attention are inconsistent. Sometimes caregivers are emotionally unavailable, distracted, or overwhelmed by their own struggles. In other situations, affection may only appear when the child behaves in certain ways that please the adults around them. The child may be praised when they perform well, appear impressive, or meet certain expectations, but receive little emotional connection when they simply express their natural feelings. Under these circumstances, the child begins to draw powerful conclusions about themselves. They may learn, often unconsciously, that their authentic emotions are not entirely safe or welcome. If sadness, anger, fear, or vulnerability are ignored or rejected, the child may begin to hide those parts of themselves. Instead, they develop a version of themselves that receives approval. This constructed identity becomes a survival strategy designed to maintain connection with caregivers. Over time, the child may become very skilled at presenting the traits that gain attention and admiration. They might focus on achievements, charm, confidence, or superiority. These qualities can bring praise and recognition, which temporarily fill the emotional gap left by the lack of deeper connection. But beneath that external image, the original sense of insecurity often remains unresolved. Because the authentic self was never fully affirmed, the individual may grow up with a fragile internal sense of worth. Instead of feeling inherently valuable, they may feel that their value depends on how others respond to them. Admiration, praise, and attention become essential sources of emotional stability. Without them, old feelings of inadequacy or invisibility may begin to surface. This is where narcissistic patterns begin to take shape. The person learns to rely heavily on external validation to maintain their sense of identity. They may pursue admiration through achievements, social status, attractiveness, or influence over others. The goal is not simply success or recognition. The deeper motivation is the need to keep confirming that they are important enough to be seen and valued. At the same time, genuine vulnerability may feel uncomfortable or even threatening. The child who once learned to hide their authentic emotions often continues that pattern into adulthood. Showing weakness, uncertainty, or emotional need can feel dangerous because it recalls earlier experiences where those expressions were not met with care. As a result, the person may protect themselves by maintaining an image of confidence, control, or superiority, while the more vulnerable aspects of their identity remain hidden beneath the surface. For some individuals who struggle with a fragile sense of self-worth, sexual encounters can become more than moments of physical intimacy. They can become a psychological tool used to reassure the self, even if only briefly. On the surface, it may appear that the person is simply pursuing pleasure or excitement, but beneath that behavior there is often a deeper emotional dynamic unfolding. The encounter becomes a way of answering an internal question that quietly persists within them. Am I desirable? Am I important enough to be wanted? When someone expresses attraction or desire, it sends a powerful signal of validation. It communicates that another person sees them as valuable, appealing, or worthy of attention. For a person whose internal sense of worth is unstable, that validation can feel incredibly powerful. In that moment, the doubts they carry about themselves may temporarily fade. The admiration or desire of another person acts like a mirror reflecting back a more reassuring image of who they are. Because of this, the emotional reward attached to sexual attention can become very strong. The encounter itself may not primarily be about intimacy or mutual connection. Instead, it becomes about the feeling that arises from being chosen. Being desired can provide a short-lived sense of completeness, as if the emptiness inside has briefly been filled. The person may feel confident, admired, and significant in ways that they struggle to feel when they are alone with themselves. However, this sense of confirmation is usually temporary. Once the moment passes, the deeper insecurity that existed beforehand often returns. The internal doubts about worth and identity were never truly resolved by the encounter itself. They were only quieted for a short period of time. When the emotional reassurance fades, the person may once again feel the subtle discomfort of not feeling fully secure within themselves. At this point, the mind may begin seeking another opportunity for the same form of reassurance. If one sexual encounter temporarily restored a sense of worth, the individual may unconsciously believe that another one will do the same. Over time, this pattern can develop into a cycle. Each new interaction offers a brief sense of validation, followed by the gradual return of the same inner uncertainty that existed before. In this way, the encounter becomes less about the partner and more about the psychological effect the partner provides. The other person is valued not primarily for who they are as an individual, but for the emotional confirmation they offer. Their attraction serves as proof that the narcissistic individual is still desirable, still admired, still capable of commanding attention. Ironically, this pattern can move a person further away from the kind of connection they may actually need. Genuine intimacy requires emotional openness, vulnerability, and a willingness to be seen beyond surface qualities. But if the primary goal of the interaction is self-confirmation, the relationship may remain focused on maintaining an image rather than revealing the deeper self. As a result, sexual encounters can become a repeated attempt to stabilize an unstable sense of identity. Each interaction briefly reinforces the belief that they are worthy and desirable, even though the underlying insecurity remains unresolved and continues quietly influencing their behavior. When a person seeks validation through attention, admiration, or sexual attraction, the feeling that follows can be powerful, but remarkably short-lived. In the moment, the experience may create a rush of confidence and emotional relief. Being desired or admired can momentarily silence the quiet doubts that exist beneath the surface. For a brief period, the individual may feel complete, important, and reassured about their value. It can feel as though the internal emptiness has finally been filled, yet this sense of fulfillment rarely lasts for long. The reason the validation fades so quickly is that it addresses only the surface of a deeper emotional need. The external admiration confirms something temporarily, but it does not change the underlying beliefs a person holds about themselves. If someone carries a deeply rooted sense of inadequacy or insecurity, a moment of praise or desire cannot permanently replace those internal feelings. It acts more like a temporary covering rather than a true healing of the wound beneath. In many cases, the initial excitement following validation begins to diminish almost as soon as the moment has passed. The compliments, attention, or intimacy that once felt so powerful start to lose their emotional intensity. What felt reassuring in the moment slowly fades into the background, and the person may begin to notice a familiar sense of emptiness returning. The mind then starts searching again for another experience that can recreate that feeling of being admired or desired. This process can become cyclical. The person learns, often unconsciously, that certain interactions provide a quick emotional boost. Attention from others becomes a kind of temporary remedy for the discomfort they feel inside, but because the relief is brief, they must seek it again and again. Each new source of validation promises the same feeling of reassurance, yet each one eventually fades in exactly the same way. Over time, this cycle can become exhausting. The individual may constantly pursue situations where they can receive adoration or approval, believing that the next experience will finally bring lasting satisfaction. Yet because the deeper emotional needs remain unaddressed, the sense of fulfillment continues to slip away shortly after it arrives. What initially felt like confidence begins to resemble a constant search for confirmation. Another reason the validation fades is that external approval cannot fully stabilize a person's identity. When someone's sense of self depends heavily on how others respond to them, their emotional state becomes vulnerable to constant fluctuation. A compliment may temporarily elevate them, while a lack of attention or a perceived rejection can quickly bring feelings of insecurity back to the surface. The person becomes dependent on outside reactions to maintain their internal balance. As this pattern continues, the gap between the external image and the internal experience can grow wider. Outwardly, the individual may appear confident, admired, or socially successful. Inwardly, however, the reassurance they receive never fully settles into a lasting sense of self-worth. Each new moment of validation briefly lifts them, but the emotional ground beneath them remains unstable, causing the same feelings of uncertainty to quietly return again and again. Fear of genuine vulnerability can quietly stand between a person and the kind of deep intimacy they may consciously desire. On the surface, someone might appear confident, charming, or emotionally self-sufficient. They may engage in relationships, attract attention, and even form connections with others. Yet beneath this outward behavior there can exist a powerful internal resistance to being truly seen. That resistance is not always deliberate. Often it grows from earlier experiences where openness or emotional exposure felt unsafe. True intimacy requires something that cannot be performed or controlled. It asks a person to reveal their authentic self, including insecurities, fears, needs, and imperfections. It means allowing another human being to witness not only the strengths and attractive qualities, but also the vulnerable parts that most people try to hide. For someone who learned early in life that vulnerability led to rejection, criticism, or neglect, this kind of openness can feel deeply threatening. In such cases, the individual may develop protective strategies designed to avoid emotional exposure. They may cultivate an image of confidence, independence, or superiority. These traits can create a sense of control and prevent others from seeing the more fragile aspects of their inner world. As long as they maintain this protective image, they can interact with others while keeping their deeper feelings hidden. This protective pattern can affect how relationships unfold. The person may still pursue connection, but the connection often remains limited to safer levels of interaction. Conversations may stay on the surface, focused on achievements, humor, attraction, or admiration. Emotional topics that require genuine openness might be avoided or quickly redirected. Even when relationships become physically close, the emotional depth may remain restricted. Sexual or romantic encounters can sometimes function within this protective structure. Physical intimacy can create the appearance of closeness without necessarily requiring the full emotional exposure that genuine intimacy demands. The individual may share moments of passion or attraction while still keeping their inner vulnerabilities guarded. This allows them to experience connection while maintaining the protective distance that feels necessary for their emotional safety. However, the avoidance of vulnerability often carries an unseen cost. While it protects the person from the fear of rejection, it also prevents the deeper sense of connection that comes from being truly known. Intimacy grows through shared honesty, emotional transparency, and mutual understanding. When one person keeps significant parts of themselves hidden, the relationship may struggle to reach that deeper level of closeness. The fear itself is often rooted in earlier emotional experiences. If a child learns that expressing certain feelings leads to dismissal, shame, or punishment, they may conclude that showing vulnerability is dangerous. As they grow older, that lesson remains embedded in their emotional system. Even when they encounter people who might respond with care and understanding, the protective instinct can still remain active. Because of this, the barrier to intimacy is not simply a lack of desire for closeness. In many cases, the individual may genuinely long for meaningful connection. The difficulty arises from the tension between that desire and the internal fear of being emotionally exposed. The mind attempts to maintain safety by avoiding situations where the authentic self might be revealed too deeply, even when that avoidance quietly limits the depth of relationships that could otherwise form. Healing rarely begins with dramatic change or sudden transformation. More often, it starts with a quiet moment of awareness. A person begins to notice patterns in their thoughts, emotions, and behaviors that once felt automatic. Instead of simply reacting to life in the same familiar ways, They pause long enough to observe what is happening within them. This awareness is not about blaming oneself or searching for flaws. It is about gently recognizing the deeper forces that have been shaping one as experiences for many years. For individuals who have developed patterns of seeking validation, avoiding vulnerability, or protecting themselves through emotional defenses, awareness can be the first step toward freedom. When these patterns remain unconscious, they continue to guide behavior without being questioned. A person may repeatedly pursue certain relationships, react strongly to criticism, or feel an ongoing emptiness without fully understanding why. Awareness allows these patterns to move from the hidden background into conscious understanding. Yet awareness alone is often not enough. If a person looks at their patterns with harsh judgment or shame, the mind may immediately become defensive. Self-criticism can recreate the same emotional environment that originally led to the formation of these defenses. When someone tells themselves that they are broken, selfish, or unworthy because of their struggles, the deeper wounds remain untouched and may even grow stronger. This is why self-compassion becomes an essential part of the healing process. Self-compassion means approaching one's own pain with the same understanding and patience that we might offer to another human being. It involves recognizing that many of our behaviors were originally attempts to cope with difficult emotional circumstances. The strategies that once helped a person survive or adapt may continue into adulthood even when they are no longer helpful. When someone begins to view their patterns through the lens of compassion, something important changes internally. Instead of fighting against themselves, they start to develop curiosity about their experiences. They may begin asking gentle questions. What was I feeling in that moment? What was I afraid of losing? What part of me was trying to feel safe or accepted? These questions create space for deeper understanding rather than reinforcing shame. Through this compassionate awareness, a person can gradually reconnect with the parts of themselves that were previously hidden or rejected. Emotions that were once avoided may begin to surface in a safer and more manageable way. Instead of reacting automatically, the individual gains the ability to respond more consciously. They start to recognize when old patterns are being triggered and can slowly experiment with different ways of relating to themselves and others. Healing in this sense is not about becoming a completely different person. It is about rediscovering aspects of the self that were pushed aside in order to cope with earlier experiences. As awareness grows and self-compassion deepens, the need for constant external validation often begins to soften. The individual gradually learns that their worth does not have to be proven through admiration, performance, or control. This process unfolds slowly through many small moments of honesty and kindness toward oneself. Each moment of awareness weakens the hold of old patterns, and each act of self-compassion strengthens the sense of inner stability that allows a person to experience connection, vulnerability, and authenticity with greater ease. In the end, what we often label as narcissistic behavior is not simply about arrogance, selfishness, or an endless appetite for attention. Beneath the surface, there is usually a human being who learned very early that their value depended on how others responded to them. The constant search for admiration, the fear of vulnerability, and the pursuit of validation through relationships are often attempts to soothe a much deeper sense of disconnection from the authentic self. But the moment a person begins to see these patterns clearly, something important becomes possible. Awareness interrupts the automatic cycle. Instead of endlessly chasing confirmation from the outside world, they can begin turning inward with honesty and compassion. They start recognizing that the emptiness they have been trying to fill was never truly about sex, attention, or admiration. It was about the longing to feel worthy, accepted, and real. And when someone learns to meet themselves with that same acceptance, the endless search for validation slowly begins to lose its power. The need to prove oneself fades, and in its place grows the capacity for genuine connections built not on performance or admiration, but on authenticity, vulnerability, and the simple courage of being truly seen.